Thank you all for joining us this evening, and particularly, of course, to Anthony Doffey. It's a great honour to have you here. My name is Christian Weikop, just to identify myself, and I'm delighted to be in conversation this evening with Keith Hartley, as Neil said, a great expert on modern and contemporary German art. So we're going to talk about Georg Baselitz, and Baselitz was born, in fact, Hans-Georg Kern in the small village of Deutsch Baselitz in Saxony in 1938. And in 1961, he formally changed his name to Baselitz after his birthplace. This was a few years after moving from East to West Germany, where he was expelled. He was expelled from the East Art Academy, the East Berlin Art Academy, for socio-political immaturity. Whatever that means. And I just want to ask you, Keith, why do you think that he felt compelled to change his name to Baselitz, given his compulsion to move away from his homeland?
I think part of it was when he moved from East Berlin to West Berlin and moved academies, he sort of then studied at the West Berlin Academy of Art. All the rage was French art and then American art, certainly after the 1958 exhibition in Berlin of contemporary American abstract expressionist art. Everyone was looking abroad. Germany didn't really have a tradition, at least it was, people weren't able immediately to pick up on that pre-war tradition because there was this hiatus of the Nazi period. And then, of course, if you were born in and brought up in East Germany, you would then have a different tradition, a socialist realist tradition. So moving to West Berlin, he was then confronted with this total reverence for the latest art coming out of France, the latest art coming out of America. And although initially he was totally immersed in this and was really interested in it, I think eventually he said, you know, this is not really going to do it for me, and he felt the need to say, well, what am I? I'm a German artist. I was born and brought up in a place called Deutsch Baselitz, and which means German Baselitz. And so, remembering that someone who also taught at the academy in West Berlin, Schmidt-Rottluff, his name was Schmidt. He was brought up in Rottluff. He was a German expressionist artist, a member of the Brücker artists. He decided, well, this is something I can copy from them. And so that was why he wanted to sort of say, I'm German, I'm from Saxony.
And of course, Emil Nolde also took his name, Nolde, from his birthplace in Schleswig-Holstein. I mean, there's a tradition, isn't there, I think, of, you know, German artists going back to Prague, you could say, you know, taking their name from the...
Yes, and sort of realizing you're part of a German tradition.
A German
of
tradition.
Art.
Do you think, I mean, Baselitz clearly feels strongly tied to a German tradition, you know, perhaps like Emil Nolde, but do you think, more specifically, he feels a connection to a Saxon tradition, that is to say, you know, those artists who lived or worked or indeed studied in Dresden and other cities, you know, the Brücker artists, for instance, Caspar David Friedrich, Ludwig Richter, who he references, and even Gross and Otto Dix spent time studying in Saxony, in Dresden. Do you think there's a sort of Saxon connection there in addition to the German one, as it were?
Certainly, there's one artist you haven't mentioned, not terribly well known, a 19th century artist called Ferdinand von Reisky. Mm-hmm. And Baselitz always remembered being taken to the gallery in Dresden and being shown these works by Reisky, by his uncle. and they made a big impact on him, landscapes and figure paintings. And when he started to sort of look again around 1960, early 1960s, said, what should I be doing as a German artist? He started a whole series of heads called Reisky heads, based very roughly on these paintings of a not terribly well-known 19th century, rather painterly artist called Ferdinand von Reisky. So I think, yes, I think he wanted to see himself as a German artist. He wanted to see himself more specifically as an artist from Saxony. And so, you know, in a way, it was, you know, putting his feet into the ground.
I mean, he explicitly references Ludwig Richter in his work here from 1965, Ludwig Richter on his way to work. And some of the prints, Baselitz's early woodcuts, also have LR in the print itself. I'm not sure what he thinks about Richter, actually.
I don't think Richter necessarily is, I think probably because he comes from that part of Germany, but I think what he's doing here in this work, looking back to Richter, is picking up on something that had happened actually in Britain. There is a series of very famous paintings by Bacon called Van Gogh on His Way to Work, which were painted, I think in the early 60s, had a big impact at the time. And so I think that is what, I mean, here he's looking back to a Saxon artist, but I think also at the back of his mind
is also Bacon.
These Bacon paintings.
That's very
Another figurative artist, of course, not an abstract artist.
And what about these late works by Georg Gross? You see here The Wanderer from 1943, which also feature a kind of desolate, war-torn landscape with a figure wandering through, rather bedraggled figure there. Do you think the late works of Gross may have also had an impact?
Whether he actually knew of them, of course, these were painted when Gross was in America, painted during the war. So I think the likelihood of Baselitz knowing them is...
Although, I mean, Gross and Dix, who you see here on the left, Nighttime Encounter with a Madman, both Gross and Dix were much celebrated in the DDR.
Yes, I mean, Dix, of course, was trained in Dresden. He then went on to teach in Dresden before the war, and after the war, he continued. Actually, in the post-war period, he lived both in East and West Germany. He lived in Dresden, and he was, when the authorities, and particularly the art authorities in East Germany, were trying to look back and find artists who they could see as part of a new tradition, of a sort of a socialist workers' tradition of art. It was one of the artists that they were very keen on was Otto Dix. And in 1957, there was this major retrospective in East Berlin, which included this. Comes from a series of
the war cycle,
prints, the war cycle, but also a great triptych called the War Triptych, which was later acquired by the museum in Dresden, which showed a sort of punished wasteland of the trenches in the First World War, because Dix had been in the First World War, and it showed mangled bodies, parts of bodies. It was meant to be horrific and was horrific, and I think this had a big impact on Baselitz at that time, and particularly on some of the paintings he then went to do in the early 60s.
I think so. I mean, you can see here, if you look at first big drawing from 1963 by Baselitz, the sort of nocturnal, almost extraterrestrial nature of the scene, I think, connects with this particular Dix nighttime encounter with a madman.
Wasteland and these figures who were, and he often actually just painted parts of bodies, a whole series of paintings.
Okay. So Baselitz really caused a sensation in 1963 when this work, which you see on the left-hand side, The Big Night Down the Drain, was exhibited at the new Michael Werner Gallery in Berlin. And the exhibition of this work resulted in the confiscation of the work and a fine both for the artist and dealer. I mean, aside from the clearly provocative nakedness of these particular artworks, what was the novelty factor, if you like, of Baselitz's paintings and prints when he first appeared on the German art scene in the early 1960s?
I mean, perhaps I can say that probably he's picking up on a famous incident at the time. It was of Brendan Behan, the poet, who appeared at one of his poetry readings, totally drunk and with his flies open and not caring. And so what Baselitz was doing here, he was sort of flinging the gauntlet down to the establishment and saying, I want to be a figurative artist, I want to deal with the sort of materiality of paint, and it was a very aggressive stance, really, because being a figurative artist at that time in Germany was totally taboo. I mean, everyone was looking towards abstraction. Partly, of course, it was because not wanting to face up to the realities of what just happened in Germany with the concentration camps, the death camps, all that sort of history. And so being able to paint figures at that time was something that people didn't want to do.
No, that's right, that's right.
And so he was seen as retrograde, looking backwards.
Yes. I mean, Expressionism had been rehabilitated to a certain degree after the war, so that German public were encouraged to view Expressionist art as not degenerate, as it were, certainly from the first Documenta in Kassel in '55, but also, as you say, there's this great promotion of abstraction and to sort of paint figuratively. And I think he's almost referencing, the degenerate art shows of '37 in this work in some way. Here we have a degenerate body, do we not, in Big Night Down the Drain.
The face seems to be sort of disintegrating.
The face seems to be disintegrating. When he produced a remix version of this painting in 2005, the facial features of Hitler seem to be coming through there. It's not the first time, I think, that Baselitz, references Hitler. I mean, if we look at a modern painter from 1966, the face looks rather Hitlerian. Again, I think of Gross, the late Gross works, Hitler in Hell, from '44, this desolate sort of figure.
But Hitler as a failed painter, of course.
Hitler as a failed painter,
yes,
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a challenge then to this idea of abstract art, this promotion of abstract art, and perhaps also a challenge to the socialist realism of the East in what he's doing.
And of course, it's also himself as well,
yes.
Baselitz. I mean, here he is, a painter who paints figures, who paints lonely painters. A lot of these, here it's called a modern painter.
Yes.
A rebel. We have all these sorts of terms. Heroes. In a way, he's looking, slightly ironically, at himself as this rebel, as an outsider who's daring to paint figures.
Yes.
In this wasteland.
Yes.
And so I think it's very much to do with himself.
Yes. I mean, thinking about the provocative nakedness of Big Night Down the Drain, we can also see, if we compare Baselitz's homage to Wrubel of '63 with a Sheila painting, self-portrait, masturbating, there seems to be a sort of tradition in expressionist art of taboo breaking images there. I think, you know, this is clearly, the Baselitz is clearly this homage to the Russian symbolist artist Mikhail Frubel, but I think, you know, it actually has more to do with Sheila and possibly Soutine, if you look at the sort of butchered flesh aspect of Baselitz. Would you agree with that,
Well,
Keith?
certainly Soutine was a great favourite of his, and when one of the first trips he made outside Germany, he went to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and was very, very taken with Soutine's work, in particular a painting of a flayed ox, which is a sort of almost like a stand-in for a human being.
So do you think, you mentioned Bacon earlier on, in fact, you know, this interest in flesh comes through
exactly,
Bacon and Soutine.
Yes, I mean, the expressionist, Baselitz always had a sort of ambivalent attitude, one could say, towards expressionists. He didn't regard himself as an expressionist, and he felt that his art was totally different. It was to do with more to do with the painting as an object, rather than a relationship with the outside world and deforming something in the outside world.
Nonetheless, I mean, it's intriguing, I think, to put, you know, the sort of looking at the contortions and distortions of Baselitz's work. We look at the Great Friends here from 1965 and put that alongside Sheila, or indeed a Kokoschka, famous Kokoschka poster for Murder or Hope of Women of 1909. He is, irrespective of what he says, you know,
it's difficult to ignore some of these sort of expressionist gestures in some of the works, even though he says, you know, I'm not interested in sort of gestural painting or the gesture of the human body in that respect. But
yes, that's right. I mean, I asked Ansan Kiefer in an interview just over a year ago about the impact of East German art education, in a sense, on Baselitz's work. And Kiefer said that he felt that there was no connection to Baselitz whatsoever in that respect, and that Baselitz absolutely hated the DDR. And so while I accept that Baselitz loathed the DDR and its cultural policy, when I look at some of the so-called hero paintings, there does seem to be some kind of residue, if you like, of the heroism of socialist realism. Would you agree with that?
Well, and in particular, actually, of novels. Because after, when he got to the West and he was encouraged by his tutor, Hannes Trier, to read certain books, and of course he came from the East, and so he didn't know a lot of the new literature that was coming out, and didn't know the work of James Joyce or Musil and writers like this. But then he felt he wanted to look back at some of the Eastern heroes, the sort of the Soviet heroes of literature, and he started to read some of the Russian writers, particularly those who were published in the Weimar Republic in the 20s. And a lot of these novels at that time had, you know, the socialist hero and revolutionary. And he said that quite a lot of these hero paintings were based on
Russian literature.
Yes.
That's very interesting. I was also wondering whether, you know, this response to the heroic figure is also an ironic take, if you like, on official National Socialist art, these images of muscular peasants and such like that you see in the work of Georg Sleutermann, for example, from 1939, The Farmer. And of course, these images of farmers proliferate, don't they, in National Socialist art.
But the interesting thing is that quite a lot of these figures, you know, they've got short trousers. You know, I think they're young people. They're probably pioneers, you know, socialist pioneers. They're the equivalent of Boy Scouts in East Germany. But they're in this, you know, devastated world. You've got to remember that he came from just near Dresden. Dresden, after the war, was totally bombed, it was a wasteland. And so this is the sort of, he's seeing himself as an artist in this wasteland.
In this rubble
so in
kind
a
of
way, it's seeing himself as a young boy, really, in this sort of ironic fashion.
kind of so autobiographical, but
I think also, as well as looking back to the devastation of the Second World War, looking back even further through the eyes of Dix to the First World War, and even further, and I think particularly in the way they're holding these big flags, looking back to the 30 Years' War I think that was in the 16th century, when that part of Central Europe had been devastated by religious wars.
Absolutely.
And
so it's multi-layered. It's responding to many different sources. I mean, Baselitz famously withdrew his paintings from Documenta 6 in protest at the participation of official representatives of the DDR, a number of whom you see here, Bernhard Heisig, Tubka, Wolfgang Matur. Can you see any connection, just to press home this point, any connection between Baselitz and these DDR artists? I'm thinking in particular Heisig, who has a certain kind of expressionistic brushstroke. I'm sure it is a comparison Baselitz would dislike, but do you think there's any connection at all to these artists associated with the old Leipzig school?
Well, I think that when Baselitz was thrown out, really, of the art school in East Berlin, and really, in order to carry on wanting to become an artist, he had to move to the West. This sort of turned him against the system in the East wholeheartedly. It's quite interesting that he actually, sort of growing up there, and he's talking to an artist friend of his, Penck. They totally believed in the system in East Germany, in socialism. In fact, Baselitz sort of painted some of the socialist heroes, like Stalin as well. So when he was forced out of that, he sort of did a volte-face and sort of hated it, really. I mean, which is a very typical psychological reaction, really. And so, not only, I mean, also he was furious that the West Berlin Academy was actually considering taking on one of the East German artists
professors
as a professorship, and he resigned. This is a bit later, because he was at that time teaching himself, Baselitz, at the West Berlin Academy, and he said, "Well, I'm not going to sit on the same committee as that person."
Very interesting. Okay, so we'll leave socialist realism for a moment and talk a little bit about Baselitz's relationship to Anselm Kiefer, because in the early 1970s, Baselitz actually was the first to acquire works by Kiefer from the pioneering exhibition 14 mal 14, organized by Klaus Gallwitz, who later staged the German pavilion of the Venice Biennale in 1980, also including Baselitz and Kiefer. And actually, at one point in the early 70s, they were living within 100 kilometers of each other in this forest region in the Palatinate. And Baselitz told me that he felt a very strong connection to Kiefer. How would you explain the nature of that connection?
I think because, in a way, they both came from a later generation. They although Baselitz is older than Kiefer and lived through the war, but only as a child. So they're not part of that generation who, either supported Hitler or felt they had to go into the war and take part in it. And they were both, looking at the devastation that it caused. And we've seen already in works we've seen of Baselitz, but also Kiefer's work. I mean, he, in very famously did this series of works where he went to various parts of Europe and did the
Sieg Heil,
Sieg Heil, the Nazi salute, in an ironic way, but sort of all trying to sort of face up to realities. So, in a way, they both were fascinated by that period and
confronting history.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, both artists, as I mentioned earlier, were then exhibited later on together in this famous show at the Venice Biennale in 1980. And the display caused total sensation. And it led some German critics to accuse them of aesthetic regression, and in some cases, borderline neo-fascism. This initial critical reception misrepresented, I think, what these artists were doing, and they were soon to be promoted outside of Germany, not least in Anthony Doffe's gallery in London, at the RA, at the Whitechapel, and also in New York. Can you recall the sensation around that Venice Biennale, Keith? I mean,
yeah. I mean, obviously, you can see this model for a sculpture, so it's not, as it were, finished. You can still see the block of wood that had just come out. He hasn't sort of. In fact, he said it was you could almost not finish it because it would probably topple backwards if you started to cut it away. But it has, you've got the right hand raised in that way, and people tended to see it purely in those sort of terms. Baselitz always said, that's the last thing. I'm not thinking of that at all. I was thinking of just a human gesture.
Yes, that's right.
But as you said, it created a furore at the time. But Baselitz went on to do a whole series of sculptures.
Yes.
And in fact, we had hoped to be able to show two of them here, but unfortunately they were too big to get into the building.
So, I mean, Baselitz then said that he felt a strong connection to Kiefer, but he also told me that he felt a considerable distance, actually, from Kiefer's mentor, Joseph Beuys. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that. What Baselitz was doing was clearly rather different to what was occurring in the Kunstakademie in Dusseldorf, and all the artists around Beuys in the 60s, early 70s. And, this distance that Baselitz felt to Beuys, can this be explained?
I think it's sort of two things, really. I mean, I think firstly and foremost, it's a generational thing. Beuys had, he was a pilot in the war, and so he was of that earlier generation. And then also, Beuys had a totally different view of art. His art was to do with himself and relationship with society. And Baselitz, on the other hand, always felt that art was to do with art, and that paintings, it's not to do with depicting objects or illustrating objects, that paintings were objects. And so it was more of, in fact, he always said, when people criticized him for being an art's sake artist, he said he sees that as a badge of honor, because that's what he feels art is about. Whereas Beuys always felt that art had to deal with society as a whole.
And also, do you think that, Beuys was very much, I think, interested in dissolving the boundaries between different media, as were a number of the artists around him. And if you think about Baselitz, however rebellious he may be, he's still working, in a sense, within the traditional categories of painting, sculpture, printmaking, right?
Different conceptions of art, really, and in that respect, he's much more in tune with Kiefer's work.
Right.
Oh, and with other artists such as Penck and Lüpertz.
Lüpertz.
Yeah.
yes. Which brings us on to my next point. You know, in the late 1970s and early 80s, when Baselitz's work started to receive, you know, more international coverage, some critics, mostly American, one has to say, referred to his work, as they did Kiefer's, as neo-expressionist. And Baselitz told me that he disliked this label, as did Kiefer, but Baselitz came to reluctantly accept it. Do you think this term, this problematic term, neo-expressionism, is an appropriate way to characterize Baselitz's work? And if there is some truth to the label, in what sense does Baselitz's work relate to first-generation expressionism? Many examples of which we see here in this room, especially, you know, these artists associated with the Brücke, such as Erich Heckel, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner.
Yeah, when asked about this, he quite liked the fact that there were all these new painters, and he thought it was, because he was a painter himself and a sculptor, he liked the fact that there were more young German artists working like that. But on the other hand, he always rejected, I think, himself as having any real relationship with expressionism, although the younger artists often did have a very explicit relationship with expressionism. Mm-hmm. But he felt that his art was much more to do. He said, I'm not interested in the swiftness of a gesture, trying to capture gestures when I paint. I don't paint or draw in front of the motif. Whereas this work, for example, by Kirchner, this is, he used to do these very quick sketches, 10, 15 minutes. There's also one up on the wall over there, and it was to do with the relationship between you and the model, and the actual gestures of the hand gestures of trying to capture that relationship that goes down on the painting or drawing. Whereas with Baselitz, it was all internal. He always insisted that the work of art is autonomous. Mm-hmm. He disliked this idea of the relationship between the work and something mm-hmm. outside of itself. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of the Gothic maiden prints from outside. Mm-hmm. And they're almost like a meditation. I mean, they're all done from out of his head. Mm-hmm. You know, Elke, his wife, wasn't sitting down, mm-hmm. sort of thing, and I'll sketch you. It was something mm-hmm. that, it was a meditation on the female form.
Because superficially, I suppose, if you look at a work by Kirchner, this brush and ink work here, compared to the Gothic Maiden's print, superficially there seems to be this connection, certainly in the speed of execution. You refer to the 15-minute sketch that the Brücke artist practiced there. But what you're saying is actually, you know, aside from the inversion of the motif, which is one key difference, there are other differences too that need to be considered in terms of their attitude to art.
I think so. And if you look at the prints, it's also, he's looking at the relationship between the female form and the flower printed piece of cloth mm-hmm. that she's lying on at one point. Mm-hmm. And so he then starts playing around with these motifs.
Sure.
One against the other.
Sure. So in the early 80s, you know, he produces paintings, this is Baselitz, which explicitly reference the Brücke group. Here we have the Brücke Chorus from 1983, and Supper in Dresden, also from 1983. And, you know, these works seem to be visually alluding to the work of Edvard Munch, perhaps also Arnold Schoenberg, and the stiff wooden-like figures that represent, you know, the Brücke artists here also bear some testimony to the process of interaction that was taking place, I think, between Baselitz's painting and his large figurative sculpture. There seems to be some connection there. But just have a look at a few more examples. I mean, I think if you look at Supper in Dresden, he seems to be remixing, if you like, several sources into that work, namely Kirchner's group of artists from 1926, which shows the tension between the Brücke members, and that tension is raised, I think, in Baselitz's work to a much higher level of existential crisis. But also we look at the palette, the colours of Nolde's Last Supper and Munch's The Scream. He seems to conflate these sources. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Well, I certainly think he felt very close to Munch's work. I mean, that was one artist he did relate to. He liked the fact that he said that on the whole, Munch always just painted very ordinary things, and, in very strange ways often, but he often dealt with very sort of ordinary things. And so Munch had a big impact on him, I think. I think he felt, he certainly took up the themes of the Brücke artists, but deals with them in a totally different way. I agree. Not just turning them upside down, but the way he starts playing around what he calls disharmonies.
Yes.
He calls them ornaments.
Yes.
And placing them on the canvas.
Yes.
In order then to create a harmony out of it.
Yes.
It's much more to do with picture making.
Yes, I agree. But nevertheless, if we look at prints, we look at woodcuts, we can see that the rough cut approach of Baselitz, I think, is connected to the Brücke and to Munch, even though his treatment of the motif is very different. What about mannerism, though? Because earlier this year at the Royal Academy, there was an exhibition which showed Baselitz's collection, and also the collection of the Albertina, of chiaroscuro woodcuts and mannerist prints. And I asked Baselitz about his relationship to mannerism, and he said, well, I collect mannerist prints, but it doesn't have any impact on my own work. Do you think that's slightly disingenuous?
That's not totally true, because I think if you look, we have a wonderful print, a woodcut of 1966, which we bought from Anthony's gallery. I think you may have a
It's this
image,
one here.
Yes. I mean, and where he's used this sort of printed on a green paper to give this idea of the sort of the chiaroscuro effect. And I think and a lot of these woodcuts he was doing at this time, I think, where he is using these coloured
They have the tonal values, don't they, of Goltzius.
So I think they did have a certain effect, but I think it's true generally that he, some people talking to him have suggested, well, aren't you a latter-day mannerist in a way? He totally rejects that. Because he said the mannerists reacted to their forebears, such as Michelangelo, Raphael, etc., where he said, when I grew up, he said, tradition had been killed by the Nazi war, and so I had to start off from scratch. So I couldn't be mannerist about something that I didn't really know.
I mean, yes, although if you look at, just to go back, if you look at that strolling new type of 66, the sort of small head and elongated bodies, I think, do have a connection to mannerist printmaking, and he certainly admires greatly Goltzius and De Carpi too, as we saw at the RA. He seems to have something about disembodied or decapitated heads as well. This is the large head from 66 in the NGS collection, and this is Pillow, which is in the Leicester show from 1987 there. But I want to talk to you a little bit about this technique of fracture, because the idea of decapitations and dislocations leads us on to this pictorial device that he begins really, I think, from 66.
Yes, you see it in some of the hero paintings. The trees, the branches are coming off, and also you see it, in fact, in the Rebel painting,
yes,
in the Tate painting, in some of the colour that he's applied to it, so that the arm this black paint that he applies at certain forms. So it's almost as if it was also breaking up, really. I mean, almost as if he's sort of applying a sort of cubist fragmentation.
Interesting. And what's he trying to achieve in this fracturing, do you think? I mean, it's quite a violent process, it seems to me, and you know, he often uses forest workers or trees as a kind of arboreal theme that is being fractured in some way. I mean, what does it suggest? It suggests the division of Germany? Does it suggest the destruction of Germany, do you think?
I think it's very much to do with the fact that he is up to, in the early 60s and through the hero paintings, he was looking at his situation as a painter in a thematic way. And gradually, I think he learnt to find a formal way of doing that. So fragmentation, which eventually leads on to the upside-down paintings, is a formal construct, so that he can actually deal with the idea of painting formally without, as earlier, as a subject matter, as a content.
As a content. Good. Let's move on to discuss Baselitz as a sculptor, because from 79 onwards he turns to wood sculpture, and of course there's a long tradition of wood sculpture in Germany going back through Expressionism all the way, in fact, to the line wood sculptors of the German Renaissance. You know, do you see him aligned in that tradition? I mean, we can look at some examples here of Baselitz's work from the early 80s.
So that's the Tates, and this is our sculpture in Edinburgh.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very rough. I mean, it's very rough cut, isn't it? It's.
Yes.
Do you see this as an extension of the woodcut practice in some way? Or?
I mean, of course, he couldn't, as a sculptor, turn the figures upside down. But he says, in a way, he relates much more to primitive sculpture, to often to prehistoric sculpture. He showed the Venus de Millendorf there, he likes this sort of primordial quality, this sort of one of the big aspects of Baselitz's work is aggression. This relationship between him and the work, whether it's painting, drawing, printing, woodcut printing, and of course when it comes to wood carving, you know, it's a very physical thing. You have to sort of gouge and paint. He says he uses saws, he uses axe.
Chainsaws as well.
Yes, so it's a very physical process.
One could also look at the early work of Kokoschka, the warrior, which caused such a sensation in the Kunstschau in Vienna of 1909.
Yeah.
And, you know, Baselitz also, like the Brucker artist, he collects African tribal artifacts.
In particular from the Congo. I mean, there are these, I mean, he's got a very large and wonderful collection of African sculpture. It's had a big impact on his, and he acknowledges how much he's learned from African sculpture.
Just like the Brucker artists.
Yes.
In fact, with Cameroon wood sculpture. And in fact, if you look at the late works of Kirchner from his Swiss period, some of the wood carvings he produced when he was a member or the leader of this group, a post-Brucker group called Rock Blau, you know, these kind of over life-size wood sculptures, I think, also have some connection to Baselitz there. What about then, leaving aside first-generation Expressionism for a moment, what about then the impact of American abstract Expressionism on Baselitz? I mean, he saw this show, this MoMA touring show from 1958, which ended up in the Academy in West Berlin, and these young German artists...
That's where he was studying at the time.
Where he was studying, and he saw Pollock for the first time.
And he said the biggest impact, first of all, was the crates. The crates were so big, they couldn't get them in. They were vast. And so I think it's the vastness and the ambition of these American artists that had a big impact, I think, on him. And then Pollock, he was completely won over to Pollock's work, and I think the all-over quality that you see increasingly in Baselitz's work, particularly the two works downstairs from the Ciao America series, it's, you know, there's a lot of similarities between that and the way Pollock works, and getting the rhythms going across
the rhythm is
the canvas.
It's important. I mean, he seems to be referring to both an American tradition there, you know, the all-over composition of the New York school, if you like, and also European traditions too, I think, in these works from the late 80s. You know, one of his latest shows in London, Farewell Bill, which was shown at the Gargosian earlier this year, again, explicitly referencing
to Willem de Kooning.
Willem de Kooning,
yes.
yeah.
I mean, Kooning, he felt particularly close to, because he was born in Europe. He had a sort of European sensibility, and so and he always commented on the grin on the woman's face, showing the teeth.
That's right.
Yes.
And he produces his own, Baselitz produces his own women's series, doesn't he?
Yes.
That's right. Sorry, just to go forward. I mean, I think you can see also in, you know, his work from about 2005 onwards, this sort of change in his approach to the canvas. He seems to be sort of taking a kind of lighter, you know, if we think about those sort of heavy impasto works of the late 80s, early 80s rather, those Brücke works, which are kind of Nolde-esque. He seems to change with the remix paintings from 2005 onwards to a kind of lighter, faster approach, perhaps inspired by Pollock.
I think, yes. I mean, when he decided that he could actually return to a lot of the early paintings and works that he'd made in his career, it sort of introduces a certain distance, of course, I think. And I mean, for me, they don't have the same urgency and
I was going to ask you what you think about this.
Immediacy of the earlier works, because it's him reacting to something outside himself, because that's what things that he was doing then.
There was a mixed critical response, I think it's fair to say, to the remix paintings. And I mean, when I first saw the sort of Supper in Dresden remix work in Berlin, on the one hand, I was drawn to the work. On the other, I thought, well, you know, he's kind of recycling or, you know, reutilizing his older work. What do I think about this? You know, is this a kind of bankruptcy in a sense, or is it something actually new?
I mean, to me, it has a sort of decorative quality. I mean, he always talked about his ornaments as being nothing to do with decoration. It's all to do with disharmonies. Mm-hmm. But I always feel that the remix works have a coziness about
right.
Something that he'd always criticized
right.
in other people's art, and they don't have. They have a lightness about them, which.
Do you think he was also thinking of Edvard Munch, actually, in the process of remix? Because Munch, as we saw quite recently in the Tate exhibition, you know, famously kind of reapproached his works. You know, Girls on the Bridge. Yeah. He remade many times over the course of his career. The Scream as well. You know, many different versions. Do you think he had Munch?
I mean, he said he felt justified in doing it because Munch had done sometimes the same work 20 times.
Yes.
And felt this is something he could do. But I think because I think come back to the same thing, because he's reacting to something outside himself earlier, it doesn't have this autonomous quality that you find in the earlier work.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think just, you know, to finish up very shortly, if we look at the way in which Baselitz and Kiefer, in fact, you know, have been represented, there is, isn't there? When I look at these these photographs of the two artists in their studio space, there is something about, Namuth's famous film of Pollock, about the way in which they're presented, I think, as quite heroic artists in the studio space.
Well, it's certainly not someone with a small easel and just doing that.
No, that's right.
It's getting in there and being part of the work.
That's right.
Definitely.
Okay, so I think, Keith, I'd like to thank you very much for being in conversation with me.